Combat psychology has been studied, documented, and analyzed by military institutions for as long as military institutions have existed. The arc of a sustained engagement produces identifiable physiological and cognitive effects that are consistent across individuals with different training backgrounds, different experience levels, and different personal temperaments. Effects that manifest in predictable ways, at predictable intervals, in ways that an adversary who understands them can potentially exploit. The post-engagement interval is one of the most studied phenomena in this literature. When a threat sequence ends, when the last contact is eliminated, when the radar picture clears, when the weapons stop firing, the human nervous system begins its recovery cycle. Not voluntarily, not as a decision, as a biological process that occurs independent of intent, driven by the same neurochemical dynamics that govern stress response and recovery in every context, where extreme physiological activation is followed by its cessation. The watch team that has just successfully defended a ship against a drone swarm attack does not simply continue at the same operational intensity. They continue professionally. They run the post-engagement procedures. They update the damage assessment. They transmit the contact report. They verify the weapons inventory. All of these tasks are executed, but they are executed with a nervous system that has begun its decompression, a cognitive load that has dropped from its engagement phase, maximum, a body that has started releasing the tension that sustained high-stakes decision-making accumulates in muscles and posture and breath rate. The professional discipline of the watch maintains the procedures. It does not maintain the acute threat sensitivity of the engagement phase at its full pre-engagement level. It cannot. Biology does not permit sustained maximum arousal without recovery, regardless of training. The IRGCN's operational planners had reached this conclusion, not through the academic literature on combat psychology, but through operational observation. They had watched through the intelligence collection that Iranian forces maintained on U.S. naval activities in the Gulf, the behavioral patterns of ships following defended engagement events, the post-engagement communication patterns, the radar picture management behavior, the watch rotation adjustments that ships sometimes made in the hours following an engagement to give exhausted crew members rest periods. The patterns were subtle. They were visible to careful observation, and they were consistent enough to be planned around. The destroyer had just completed the most demanding engagement of its current patrol cycle, a 21-contact attack from 3 simultaneous bearings that had run for 9 minutes and 54 seconds and had consumed a significant portion of the ship's SM, 2, and ESSM inventory across 4 engagement layers. The engagement had been defended successfully. 0 hull strikes. The commanding officer had received the post-engagement all clear from the TAO at 11:47 p.m. The damage assessment was running. The weapons inventory was being compiled. The contact report was being drafted. At 11:49 p.m., 2 minutes and 18 seconds after the engagement's conclusion, the ship's primary communication receiver picked up a transmission on the IRGCN tactical coordination frequency that the electronic warfare system had been monitoring throughout the engagement. The transmission was in Farsi. The ship's linguist, stationed at the electronic warfare console during the engagement, translated it in approximately 45 seconds. The translation was, "All units, engagement suspended, return to staging, acknowledge, a ceasefire order." Transmitted on the IRGCN's own tactical frequency, in the correct format for a unit recall, following an engagement that had just ended. The transmission's timing, arriving 2 minutes after the engagement's conclusion, was consistent with a command authority monitoring the engagement outcome and issuing a stand-down order to any units that had not yet been committed or that had survived the defensive engagement. The translation was passed to the TAO, who passed it to the commanding officer. Both men arrived at the same assessment within approximately 30 seconds of receiving the translation. The transmission might be genuine, or it might be a deception designed to exploit the post-engagement interval. The IRGCN's tactical frequency was known. It appeared in the electronic warfare system's threat library. It was possible that the transmission was a real stand-down order. It was also possible that the transmission had been designed to produce exactly the effect it would naturally produce in a crew that had just completed a 9-minute engagement. a cognitive relaxation, a readiness posture reduction, an interval of reduced acute threat sensitivity that would make a second attack more effective than the first. The commanding officer made the assessment that the operational doctrine required. He did not lower the readiness posture. He directed the watch team to treat the transmission as a possible deception and to maintain full combat watch readiness. He also directed the electronic warfare officer to monitor the tactical frequency for any follow-on transmissions and to maintain heightened alertness on the approach bearings that had been used in the first engagement. What the commanding officer did not fully account for, what no operational doctrine could fully account for because it operated below the level of decisions and directives, was the 2-minute and 18-second post-engagement interval that had already elapsed. The watch team's professional discipline would maintain the procedures. The biological recovery process had already begun regardless. The two were not equivalent, and the difference between them was exactly what the transmission had been designed to exploit. At 11:53 p.m., 6 minutes and 14 seconds after the first engagement's conclusion, 3 minutes and 56 seconds after the ceasefire transmission, the radar picture changed, not from the bearings that had generated the first engagement, from a bearing offset 41 degrees east of the primary approach axis, bearing 048 degrees, range 37 nautical miles. The contacts were different in character from the first engagement's contacts. Fewer of them. 7. Faster. The flight profiles consistent with cruise missiles rather than loitering munitions. Their speed approximately 3 times that of the first engagement's contacts. Their approach altitude slightly higher than sea skimming, approximately 40 meters. Consistent with a weapon transitioning from transit altitude to terminal sea skimming in its approach phase rather than flying sea skimming throughout. 7 cruise missiles. Different bearing. Higher speed. After a 6-minute post-engagement interval that included a ceasefire transmission, the radar operator's call reached the TAO with a slightly longer latency than the first engagement's initial detection. Not by much, not by a margin that could be attributed to any individual's failure of vigilance, by approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which the post-engagement biological recovery process had reduced the acute pattern recognition sensitivity that the first engagement's sustained threat had been maintaining at its maximum. 4 seconds that represented the measurable difference between the watch team's threat detection response time at the peak of the first engagement and their response time in the post-engagement interval. 4 seconds at the cruise missile's approach speed. Approximately 840 meters of additional closure before the call reached the TAO. Not catastrophic, not even particularly significant in isolation, but 4 seconds that demonstrated, with the precision of an operational measurement, exactly what the ceasefire transmission had been designed to produce. The TAO had the engagement sequence running before the latency effect had finished manifesting. SM-2 against the leading cruise missile contacts, the outer ring engagement, the same architecture as every previous engagement, executing with the professional efficiency of a watch team that had been doing exactly this for 21 days, regardless of what their nervous systems were doing in the background. 2 SM-2 interceptors against the 2 leading contacts at 31 nautical miles. Both intercepts confirmed at 27 and 25 nautical miles respectively. 5 contacts remaining, 24 nautical miles. But the engagement picture had a feature that the first engagement had not presented. The 7 contacts were not all cruise missiles. 3 of them were. The other 4, the 4 trailing contacts whose flight profiles had initially appeared consistent with the cruise missile signature of the lead group, had changed their behavior at 22 nautical miles in a way that the radar's track processing registered as a profile shift. The 4 trailing contacts had descended to 5 meters altitude and accelerated, their speed dropping from the cruise missile's 330 kilometers per hour to approximately 170 kilometers per hour, as they transitioned from a high-speed transit profile to the sea-skimming loitering munition profile that was characteristic of a completely different weapon system. The 4 trailing contacts were not cruise missiles. They had been mimicking the cruise missile's flight profile throughout their outer ring transit, flying at the cruise missile's transit altitude and speed to produce a radar return consistent with the cruise missile classification that the fire control system would apply, driving the SM-2 allocation decision that the TAO had just made, and then transitioning to their actual operational profile at a range where the SM-2 inventory was now partially committed, and the engagement timeline for the inner ring was compressed. The tactical design was now fully legible. 3 actual cruise missiles, which had already absorbed 2 SM-2 interceptors and had 3 remaining. 4 profile-mimicking loitering munitions that had used the cruise missile classification to generate a suboptimal interceptor allocation, and were now inside the optimal SM-6 engagement range and approaching the ESSM threshold from a standing start. The 6-minute post-engagement interval and the ceasefire transmission had been the preparation. The profile mimicking had been the tactical execution. The second engagement had been designed around the specific interceptor allocation decisions that the first engagement's profile would drive. The TAO recognized the profile shift immediately and rebuilt the engagement allocation in the 7 seconds it took the Aegis system to reclassify the 4 trailing contacts. Third SM-2 against the surviving lead cruise missile at 20 nautical miles. The single interceptor. Allocation accepting the risk that the outer ring engagement against the cruise missiles was running lean, because the SM-6 inventory needed to address the 4 loitering munition contacts that had now broken from the cruise missile profile and were approaching on separate approach vectors. 4 SM-6 interceptors, 1 per loitering munition contact. The SM-6's active seeker was the engagement preference against contacts that had just demonstrated an ability to mimic other weapons' signatures. If the loitering munitions were carrying electronic countermeasures that could manipulate radar classification, the active seeker's independent tracking was more resilient to those countermeasures than a semi-active guidance chain that depended on the ship's fire control radar maintaining a clean classification lock. 1 SM-6 per contact. 4 launches in a 3-second ripple. The SM-2 against the third cruise missile connected at 18 nautical miles. Confirmed elimination. 2 cruise missile contacts remaining at 17 and 15 nautical miles. The 4 SM-6 interceptors were tracking the loitering munition contacts simultaneously. First intercept confirmed at 14 nautical miles. Second intercept at 12 nautical miles. Third SM-6. The contact had not simply transitioned to a loitering munition profile. It had descended further, to approximately 2 meters altitude, placing it in the sea surface return clutter band that the SM-6's seeker had the most difficulty discriminating against. The seeker acquired, but its tracking solution showed the elevated uncertainty of a near-surface contact in the Gulf's ambient clutter environment. The intercept geometry was marginally adequate. The SM-6 detonated within the lethal radius, but at the outer edge of it. The contact's radar return showed structural disruption but not immediate elimination. Probable kill. 4th SM-6 intercept confirmed at 10 nautical miles. The 2 remaining cruise missiles were now at 14 and 11 nautical miles. 2 ESSM interceptors, 1 against each remaining cruise missile contact. The fire control solutions for the ESSM engagements were being built on the updated track picture that the refined cruise missile classifications had produced. First ESSM intercept confirmed at 8 nautical miles. Second ESSM. The contact had executed a terminal bearing change at 6 nautical miles. The same evasion technique that had produced an ESSM miss in the first engagement wave. The fire control system's updated evasion model, built from the first engagement's observed terminal behavior, had preloaded a correction factor. The ESSM's intercept geometry adjusted. The intercept connected at 5.4 nautical miles. The probable kill contact from the SM-6 engagement, the loitering munition that had survived the outer edge detonation, was at 8 nautical miles and continuing. Its radar return was degraded, but still trackable. Its flight profile showing the aerodynamic instability of a platform, with partial structural damage but functional propulsion. A final ESSM intercept, the last ESSM interceptor. The fire control system allocated before transitioning to CIWS for any remaining contacts. The ESSM connected at 6 nautical miles. The contact's radar return collapsed at 12:01 a.m., 14 minutes and 17 seconds after the first engagement had ended, 8 minutes and 8 seconds after the second engagement had begun. The radar picture was clear. The CIC was quiet with the specific quality of a space that had been through 2 engagements separated by a 6-minute interval that had been designed to be weaponized. The watch team ran the post-engagement procedures with the systematic efficiency of people who had done this before and understood that doing it correctly was the job regardless of what had preceded it. Damage assessment, weapons inventory, contact report. Each step executed. The combined weapons expenditure across both engagements was recorded and transmitted to 5th Fleet. First engagement, 14 SM-2 interceptors, 8 ESSM interceptors, 4 SM-6 interceptors, approximately 4,800 rounds of 20mm CIWS. Second engagement, 3 SM, 2 interceptors, 4 SM, 6 interceptors, 3 ESSM interceptors. Combined total, 17 SM, 2, 7 SM, 6, 11 ESSM interceptors across both engagements. Total cost, approximately $73 million across both engagement sequences. The electronic warfare officer submitted a separate technical report on the ceasefire transmission. The transmission had been authenticated as originating from a platform using IRGCN tactical communications equipment on a known IRGCN tactical frequency. It had not been a spoofed transmission from a non-Iranian source. It had been transmitted by an actual IRGCN platform, in the correct format, on the correct frequency. It was therefore either a genuine ceasefire order that had been transmitted between the first and second engagements, implying a command authority that had briefly considered standing down before committing the second engagement, or it had been a deliberate deception designed to produce the post-engagement relaxation interval that the second engagement was designed to exploit. The tactical analysis that accompanied the EW report made a probabilistic assessment. The 6-minute timing between the ceasefire transmission and the second engagement's launch. Specifically, the second engagement launching at the point when the post-engagement biological recovery interval was at its deepest, when the watch team's acute threat sensitivity had been allowed the longest available recovery time before being tested again, was more consistent with deliberate design than with a command. Fall-RAT. Now wise has an autobrazen. Hinseberai Sudbury. Say Rich has changed its mind. The assessment concluded that the ceasefire transmission had been an operational deception, and that the second engagement had been launched specifically to exploit the interval it was designed to create. The assessment was filed in the contact report as a red annotation, a finding that the doctrine and tactics community would review for implications beyond the immediate engagement. The immediate implication was stated in a single sentence in the commanding officer's post-engagement submission. The post-engagement interval is a tactical vulnerability, and an adversary that transmits a credible ceasefire signal on an authenticated communication channel can reliably extend and deepen that interval, without the defending crew having any means of distinguishing the deception from a genuine stand-down order. The only defense against this technique was the defense that the commanding officer had attempted to apply, directing the watch team to maintain full readiness regardless of the ceasefire signal. The direction had been given. The procedures had been maintained. What it could not change was the 4-second detection latency that the 6-minute biological recovery interval had produced. 4 seconds was not a failure of professionalism or training. It was the measurable residue of being human in a combat environment. The specific, irreducible price of a nervous system that could not sustain maximum arousal indefinitely regardless of the orders it was operating under. 4 seconds. The contact had closed 840 additional meters in those 4 seconds. The engagement had still been successfully defended. The 4-second detection gap had not changed the outcome, but the adversary had learned exactly what 4 seconds in the post-engagement interval was worth in the Central Persian Gulf at midnight against a well-trained, fully professional watch team. They had measured it. The measurement would go into their planning database. The next iteration would use it. The patrol continued. The VLS inventory, now significantly depleted across both engagements, required an expedited logistics rendezvous. The commanding officer had already transmitted the priority request to 5th Fleet. Until the rendezvous, the ship's defensive depth was reduced in ways that the commanding officer would factor into every tactical decision for the next 18 hours. The electronic warfare system continued its monitoring of the IRGCN tactical frequency. The frequency was quiet after the second engagement. No further transmissions. No acknowledgement of the stand-down order that had either been genuine or had been the instrument of a deception. The silence on the frequency provided no additional data that would resolve the assessment one way or the other. The Gulf does not explain itself. It presents operational problems and waits to see how they are resolved. The ceasefire transmission was an operational problem that had been resolved. The engagement had been defended. The second wave had been defeated. The ship held its patrol sector. The deception, if it was a deception, had not produced the hull strike that its planners had presumably intended. It had produced a 4-second detection gap and a documented vulnerability that would now be studied, debated, and incorporated into doctrine in ways that might mitigate it in future engagements. They were already being planned. The adversary that had just demonstrated the capability to exploit a 6-minute post-engagement interval through a ceasefire deception was already incorporating the result of this engagement into its next iteration. The measurement of 4 seconds would find its way into a revised attack timing. The profile mimicry technique would be refined against the defensive response it had observed. The simultaneous use of genuine IRGCN communications equipment for deception purposes would be evaluated for continued operational utility. The watch continued because the planning never stopped, on both sides of the engagement. In the Gulf, that was the only permanent condition. The planning never stopped, and the watch had to continue because the planning never stopped. That was the record. The Gulf kept no other kind.